Hi everyone. I've been wanting to do this video for a really long time. I get a lot of contact from people all over the world with questions about sourdough bread making and sourdough starters. I've been thinking about doing this for so long. I've actually compiled a list of frequently asked questions that I get about sourdough starter. So I've written them all down. I've actually got a few pages full, but I'm going to try and get through them as quickly as I can. And as part of that, I'm going to demonstrate to you how I manage my sourdough starter, which is how I've been doing it for, nearly 10 years, and it works really well for me. And a lot of people have found it a really simple and easy method. So just to begin with, Bernard Robinson, who is another Australian sourdough baker that I've had some contact with over the internet, he suggested a really great question. So actually explaining what a sourdough starter is and explain that you are feeding a living thing, also that it takes time to mature a strong starter, and explain why this is so. So thanks Bernard, I'm going to start with that. So sourdough starters, what are they? Basically they're a colony of microorganisms that live in a batter or a medium of flour and water. So when flour and water are mixed to form a batter, there are natural yeasts and bacteria and all sorts of things on the flour. Everything is covered in yeasts and microorganisms, our bodies, every piece of food we eat, everything is. So what happens is when the flour is added with water and mixed up to make a batter, basically over time, those yeasts and those microorganisms start to grow. So the yeast in your sourdough starter is what raises the sourdough starter and then what raises the bread. So the carbon dioxide which is formed, which is what makes the bubbles, that is one of the byproducts of the yeasts eating your flour. So the flour and water batter that a sourdough starter is the medium that holds the colony of microorganisms, but it also feeds them as well. And that's why sourdough starters need regular use and feeding to stay really healthy. So I guess the next question, or the next point, that it takes a really long time, or a decent amount of time, to mature a strong starter. Why that is that if you imagine this as a brand new starter, say I made it 2 weeks ago and it's got enough yeast within it to raise a loaf of bread, but it's still pretty young. So it needs a lot of time to develop that colony really strong, to have lots and lots of yeast in there, to have a really sort of stable culture. I'm not a scientist and I'm not a sourdough expert by any stretch, but this is my basic understanding of it. It just takes time for the culture to really develop some strength and to become very well populated with the yeasts and the lactic acid bacteria and things that are in there that raise the dough. I was going to say too, so the main microbial components of a sourdough starter, from my understanding, is the yeast, so the wild yeast that is being cultivated from the flour in the starter, and lactic acid bacteria. So lactic acid bacterial fermentation is really common in lots of different fermented foods, so yogurt, sauerkraut, all sorts of fermented vegetables, things like that. And that's what gives them that sour taste, which is why your sourdough has a sour taste. So, alrighty, I hope I've explained sufficiently what a sourdough starter is. Basically, it's a colony of yeasts and lactic acid bacteria that live and grow and are fed by this flour water culture that creates them to begin with. Alright, I'm not going to go through how to make a sourdough starter because I have a video on that. Please have a look. It will give you a really good step-by-step process. This starter is my starter called Boris, who many of you are familiar with, and it's been going for 9 years now, close to a decade. It's a very strong culture. It smells yeasty, like most sourdough cultures do. At the moment I've been feeding it on whole wheat and rye. I change the flours all the time. I just feed it whatever I feel like, as long as it's some combination of wheat, flour and rye, then it's quite happy, and it makes all different types of bread off whatever I feed it, so it's fine. So I'm just going to go into now my next question, or my next point. Lots of people say to me, how do you manage your sourdough starter? How do you use it all the time to make the bread? How do you get it to fit into your schedule? So this sourdough starter keeps in my fridge. In colder places in the world and in other countries where sourdough cultures have been kept for a lot longer than they have been in Australia, they would have traditionally not been kept under refrigeration. It would have been kept in a cool spot, and it would have been used every day. You know, a person who was responsible for a culture like this and, you know, feeding a household would be making bread every day. So the sourdough starter would have been refreshed every day or very frequently and fed and used. But I don't make bread every day. I live in a really small household, so I keep my sourdough starter in the fridge. So when I'm ready to make bread, all I do is I take it straight out of the fridge. I don't warm it up, I don't feed it again, I don't do anything to it. I mix it into my dough mix cold, just cold, straight out of the fridge. There's no preparation at all. As long as my starter has been fed and used and refreshed within 1 week, in my opinion, it makes no difference whether it's been in the fridge for a week or not. A week is not too long to make any difference to this culture. There's loads of yeast in here. There's all the goodies that you need to raise a loaf of bread. So I'll show you what I do, and then I kind of keep explaining it as I go. So I'm going to try and be quick with this. This video could go on forever. So yeah, so here's my culture. Just imagine that I'm going to make a loaf of bread. What I do is, as you've seen in my other video, I have my big mixing bowl. I have my flour, my salt in there, and then I put my water in, and then I just get my jar of starter. This is pretty thick. Oh, look at that. I just have to show you that. I hope you can see. It's pretty cool. I used to keep my starter runny, as you would have seen in my bread making video, but lately I'm keeping it thick. It doesn't really matter. So what I do when I make my bread, take my starter cold out of the fridge, and I tip most of it, which is usually about a cupful. There's still lots of bubbles in there, but if that was stirred down, it would be about a cup. So that goes into the bread. And then I only have a little bit left. This is really important. So I have a little bit left. There's probably only about a tablespoon of starter in there. That is all you need. I'm going to stop and explain this point actually while I'm here. Just a second. So I think this is a really key point. If you keep a really large container of starter, and then when you go to make your bread, you say you only tip off half of that and you leave half of it behind, and then you feed that up with a bit more flour and a bit more water, I think that weakens a starter over time. I think it's really important to use or discard most of your starter. So it's really important to only keep what you need to raise your loaf of bread plus a little bit more. If you have too much extra, it's not going to get fed enough. And the way I think about it is this. So if you've got, say, half of this jar, if you've got half of this jar of really hungry starter that's been in, you know, the fridge for 2 weeks or you know, has been sitting there for a while, it needs to be used and fed, then that's all going to be hungry old starter. In order to give that enough flour and water to really feed all of that, you're going to need at least the same amount again. So whereas if you start with a small amount, you've only got a small amount of really hungry starter that you're giving lots and lots of fresh food. So you're growing a whole lot more really fresh starter out of that small amount, rather than only giving a small amount of food to a whole lot of hungry starter. Does that make sense? I've been trying to think of a really good way to explain it, but that's the best way. So yeah, so just leave a little bit behind. Honestly, you only really need a scraping. There is enough yeast and bacteria in there to culture the next batch. That's all you need. If you've got a whole lot, then you're gonna have to feed it a whole lot, because all of those little hungry mouths to feed need lots more fresh flour. So this way you keep your quantities under control. So this is how I've been feeding my starter lately. So I leave my little bit left, and I just feed it with whole wheat flour. This is all I do. I go 1, 2, 3, 4. It's very scientific. And then I put in, pardon me, 1 rye. You don't have to put the 1 rye in. You can put 4 bread flour, 1 rye, 4 bread flour, 1 whole wheat, 3 rye, 2 whole wheat. You can put in whatever you want. Basically, this is about a cup of flour. I just am slack at measuring things, as you know. So roughly, when my husband does this, he gets a cup out and mixes it, measures it out with a cup. That way it's a bit more consistent. But it's kind of about a cup of flour. That's all you need. And then I just pour in a bit of water, mix it up. Don't want it to be too thick. I kind of mix it lately till it's sort of stirrable. These big weck jars are really great. You know, having a nice big straight-sided jar is a lot easier than a jar with a shoulder. A little bit more. Okay, that'll do. This is quite dry, but that's fine. Like I said before, you can make it runny. I'm not really knowledgeable on the different kinds of cultural changes that can take place when your starter lives in different conditions. I know that some people talk about, you know, wet starters favouring more lactic acid bacterial fermentation, some starters favouring more yeast. You know, I actually don't know too much about that. I have read about it in the past, but to me it makes the bread and I can't tell that much of a difference. So this cloth is pretty clean. I just usually wipe my rim. So there's my starter. It always comes up to the bottom of the strawberry, and that's about all I do. So that's exactly the same amount of starter that that made that much before. So that's all I do. I mix my dough up, and I've got my starter, and as my dough ferments during the day or overnight or however long I'm leaving it, I leave the starter with it. So if it's in summer, in our hot climate in summer, I will, and I'm going to work all day, I will keep my bread dough and my starter inside a big cooler box or a big esky with an ice brick, just to take the edge off the day. You know, we might get 35 degrees Celsius days, which is a bit too hot for sourdough starter, or it will make it go really quick anyway, and it'll be over fermented by the end of the day. So I keep it at the right temperature. It's winter here now. It's actually quite, it's only 17 degrees here in my kitchen. It's been a really windy, cold day for us. So in this sort of weather, I will just leave everything at room temperature. It's perfect. It'll be actually a little bit slow, and if I wanted to speed it up, I might put it in the oven with the light on or something like that. So that's how I mix my sourdough starter. When that has risen up again, and it's gone all bubbly and it's, you know, pretty much doubled in size, which is exactly what the dough will do alongside of it. Generally what happens with your sourdough starter is your dough will mirror your starter. So if it takes your particular starter culture on a summer's day 6 hours to rise up, your bread will pretty much do the same, because it's kind of a mirror process really. So once this has risen up alongside my bread overnight or during the day, it just goes back into the fridge for next time. So it is all repopulated, so all that fresh flour has fed all of that little starter, and it's all become all newly populated again with new fresh yeast and lactic acid bacteria, and it's fully activated. I put it in the fridge until next time. And if I'm not using my starter to make bread every week, then I will at least once a week take it out and discard it and feed it and just keep it going. Once a week is all you need. So yeah, just keep your starter in the fridge. It's the easiest way. You don't have to worry too much about it. All right, I hope I've explained that sufficiently. More might come up as I go along. So, okay, what's next on my list? Alrighty, so I talked about what flours you can use to feed your starter. Oh yeah, lots of people have asked me, they've said, oh, I've followed your video to learn how to make a sourdough starter, but they only end up with a small amount, you know, it's only about 1/4 of a cup or 1/3 of a cupful. People say, oh, how do I build it up to get the right amount for the bread? All you do is feed it up like this. So once your starter is about, you know, day 11, day 12, or, you know, between 10 days and 2 weeks old, it's getting strong enough to make a loaf of bread. It won't make a really decent loaf of bread until a few weeks down the track, but you can start to make bread with it then. So once it's at that age and you've got your small amount, just get a bigger container like this and then add about, you know, 2/3 of a cup to a cupful of flour and some water, and just feed up that small amount into a bigger amount. Let it sit out, let it rise up and bubble as it will do, and then store it in the fridge or make your first loaf of bread. So that's all you do. You just simply give it more flour and water to create that larger amount. Okay, somebody asked me the other day, how long in advance before mixing bread do you take your starter out of the fridge? Do you feed it again before mixing the loaf? So I don't take it out in advance at all. I take it out just as I'm making the bread. The starter just goes in cold. So as I said before, I don't give it another feeding. I don't do anything to it. I just mix it in cold. And in my opinion, sourdough bread really, while yeast does like a bit of warmth to get going, it doesn't need a lot of warmth. So having cool ingredients and having the process really long and slow, to me is a real benefit, especially with, you know, if you've got a busy schedule and you need to go to work or you want to go to sleep and mix it and, you know, leave it overnight, that sort of thing. Then having some cold starter in your bread flour in your dough mix is fine. It eventually comes to room temperature and starts to grow and populate and raise your dough. So there's no harm done to the yeast by being in the fridge. It just slows it down. It's kind of like a hibernation. That's all it does. It doesn't kill it or hurt it or do anything to it. It just slows it down. Okay. So some people have asked me about when they first make their starter, do they need to use pineapple juice? Because I do show a pineapple juice method in my video. No, you don't need to use pineapple juice. Pineapple juice does kind of get it going a bit quicker though, because the acid in the pineapple juice favors that lactic acid bacteria fermentation, and also the sugar, you know, there's natural sugar in the pineapple juice that does help feed the yeasts as well. So you get your culture going a little bit faster. But my dear Boris, who I've had for 9 years now, was started just simply with organic whole wheat flour and water. That's all. So you can just use water. And in fact, our friends in Antarctica who've been contacting me recently and been following their story with making their sourdough bread, they only had orange juice. And I've never heard of people using orange juice before, but they successfully started a sourdough culture with brown bread flour, so whole wheat flour, and orange juice. So there you go. There's lots of different ways you can do this. One lady got in touch with me ages ago now, but I remember it quite well. And I went back and found what she wrote. She said, "It's day 2 of my starter and it smells quite foul. Is it okay?" I think sometimes the smells associated with fermentation can people can react differently to them. Like, to me it might smell pretty good, but you know, another person might think that that smells a bit foul. So it might be an indication that there's something wrong with your starter, but it might not either. I know that when I make fermented vegetables and sauerkraut, the first few days, it does get quite pongy, particularly if there's garlic in the mixture. There's something in garlic that really kind of gets quite smelly, but then it really mellows out. However, I would say if your starter really smells bad, then maybe check your water source. Make sure that you're using filtered, clean water. If you've got some microorganisms in your water that aren't good, then that might impact on your starter. So maybe just check the water that you're using and try and use a better quality water. Speaking of water, I really do recommend not using chlorinated tap water if you can avoid it. I have a friend who manages her sourdough starter with the town water and the tap water where she lives, which is in a slightly different area to mine. But I use filtered water with my starter. It'd probably be fine with the chlorinated tap water, but the chlorine is an antimicrobial agent. That's why they put it in the water. So it's actually designed to kill off bacteria. So I'm kind of thinking that's not the best way to go. Anyway, depends on where you live and how heavily chlorinated your water is too, I guess. Oh, this is a really common question. My starter has a thin liquid floating on the top. Is that okay? Do I need to throw it out and start again? No, you don't need to throw it out and start again. A lot of starters develop that thin liquid on the top. Some people it call the hooch, and I've heard people refer to it as the alcohol. I don't know exactly what it is, but my understanding of it is, from my experience, is that you get that liquid when the culture is quite runny to begin with, and so the batter is quite a loose, wet batter, and it's a bit hungry. So what happens over time is, when the fermentation process is pretty complete and the culture has run out of food, the gluten, which is the protein part of the flour, it actually starts to break down. So you get a bit of a separation between the solids and the liquid. That's pretty much all it is. It can smell a bit alcohol-like, which is probably another sign of over-fermentation. So you can tip, if it hasn't gone too far, sometimes, I guess, if your starter's been in your fridge for a month or so and it's, you know, it might be smelling really alcohol-y, then it might be too far gone. But I would generally just tip that off and then feed it with more, you know, just feed it as you normally would, and it should come back to life. But generally that liquid on the top is pretty harmless. It's just a sign of the separation, and your starter probably hasn't been fed for a while. So keep your starter fed and happy regularly, and you won't have any problem with that. Okay, here is another great frequently asked question. People will say, my starter doesn't rise up in the jar like yours does. It's got some bubbles, but it's not rising up. Is that okay? Absolutely okay. If you've seen my sourdough bread making video, you will notice in that video that I keep my culture really runny and really wet. And I do explain in that because it's really wet, it doesn't actually rise up in the jar. And that's because the starter is too runny for it to have any structure. So when it forms the carbon dioxide gas, it's got no kind of structure around to kind of for the gas to push up the dough. So the bubbles just kind of float up through the runny batter. So if your starter is a bit on the runny side, which is fine, easy to pour off if it's runny, as long as it's really frothy and really bubbly and it smells good, then it's fine. It's fine. The bubbles will just rise to the top and you will get really tiny, really frothy bubbles. So look for froth if you prefer a runny starter. If you keep a really solid starter like I am at the moment with this one, you won't need to look for froth. There won't be any froth. There'll just be big bubbles. But obviously this is thick enough to hold it up. So the bubbles will just push it all up. So that's that one. Alrighty. The next question, how long can you keep your starter in the fridge? How often do you need to feed it? I think I probably already answered that. I like to keep mine a week maximum. It will live longer, and when I go on holidays, you know, 2 or 3 weeks, I just feed it up before I go, let it get all bubbly and then put it in the fridge probably the day before or a couple of days before, and it is fine. It keeps, you know, probably keeps for months, but I've never had any issue with keeping it 3 weeks. And then just when you get home, discard most of it and then, you know, keep just a little bit in the bottom and then refeed that up. And if you want to make it really super strong, do that a couple of times, but it will definitely keep. I think there is a difference between how long will my starter survive in the fridge. It will survive for a really long time and you can revive it by tipping out most of it and feeding up the remainder. There is a difference between that and the other question is how long will it be great to make good bread with. So survival is a really long time. Good health period for rising the bread is probably shorter. You want it to be really recently activated. So I think up to a week for regular bread baking. What's next? Are there any differences in making whole wheat, rye or other starters? So a lot of people have different starters for different bread, and when I was first learning sourdough baking, I used to do this. I had a rye starter for my rye bread and a wheat starter for my wheat bread. But at the moment, well, really for a really long time, I've just kept the one starter and I just feed it a combination of flours and use it for any bread I want. So it just depends on how much room you have and how kind of particular you want to be about it. I think, you know, the starter made with, as long as it's rye or some sort of wheat flour, it will grow the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria, which is all that you need to make sourdough bread. So, you know, just use whatever combination you want. If you want to have a pure rye starter, you know, you can just take a teaspoon of your wheat starter and feed that with rye for a few times and you've got a rye starter. You don't need to start all over again. It's essentially the same culture and it will change with what you feed it. So, you know, you don't have to go to too much trouble with that. Oh, this was a good question. This kind of relates to the hoochie one before. Someone wrote to me and said that my starter is 7 days old and there are lots of bubbles, but it smells really vinegary. Should I keep going? I've been feeding it every 24 hours and it's been quite hot, 28 degrees Celsius in brackets. So my response to that person was, it's probably gone too far. You probably do need to start again. If you're making a new starter or you've got an old starter and you've been keeping it in hot temperatures, so 28 degrees Celsius is pretty hot. The ideal temperature, I think, for sourdough starter is somewhere between, like ideally, between about 18 and 23. That's like a really sweet spot. Much colder than that and things will happen very, very slowly. They'll still grow, but very slowly. And any much hotter than that, you can manage a sourdough starter in a hotter temperature than 23 degrees Celsius, but you'll need to feed it a lot more frequently. So this person has been keeping their starter at 28 degrees Celsius and feeding it every 24 hours. So what has happened is the reason why it smells vinegary is it is changed from lactic acid bacterial fermentation into acetic acid bacterial fermentation. The next step is it will turn to alcohol. So yeah, like that's like the next stage on. So once the balance is gone to, you know, it can't maintain a stable lactic acid bacterial fermentation, it will become vinegary if it's left too long, and especially at warmer temperatures. So that's what's happened there. So keep your starter, store it in the fridge really cold, let it hibernate, but when you're feeding it and when you're growing it, try and keep it between 18 to 23 Celsius, so about 64 to 73 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's a really good temperature. So use an ice box or a cool box if you need to. If if it's in summer, a really hot climate, that's what I do, just with one ice brick in there, and it just takes the edge off the heat of the day. Okay, a lady asked me the other day, I almost killed my starter through neglect. What is the best way to rev it up again, and how will I know if it's good enough to bake with? So I've probably answered that one too. So if you've almost killed your starter in the fridge and it's looking a bit sad and it's lost all of its bubbles, which it will do if it sits in the fridge for a month, try just tipping nearly all of it out, and with the remainder you'll have maybe just leave just a teaspoon or 2 teaspoons full. Feed that up with fresh flour and water and wait till it comes alive, and then if it bounces back, if it repopulates, if there is some yeast left in there, then that's a sign that it's probably okay. And then just discard it and refeed it a couple of times just to bring it back to really good vigor. And that's how you'll know if it's good enough to bake with. If your starter, as I said before, if it rises up in its jar, if it goes really frothy and it forms carbon dioxide, then it's going to do exactly the same when you make bread. So if it's healthy and looks alive, then it's gonna, you're gonna be fine to make bread with it. That's all you're looking out for, is health and activity. All right, nearly there. Wow, this is quite a marathon. Okay, a lady called Heather asked me just yesterday. She said, I keep my flour in the fridge to avoid bugs. Would it be best to bring it to room temperature before feeding the starter? My answer to that is no, it doesn't matter. You can if you want to, but it's similar to using the cold starter in the bread dough. If you're keeping your flour in a fridge, the coolness of your flour isn't really going to affect your dough. It will make it a bit cooler, which in hot weather is actually quite advantageous. So cooler ingredients will keep it cooler for longer and slow it all down. So no, you don't need to warm anything up. It will slowly come to room temperature of its own accord. So it will do that, you can do that slower after it's mixed, or you can do it before it's mixed. It's up to you. Also, I've talked about holidays. Yeah, I guess there's one more thing, really, which is cool. We're at the end. So people ask me if you need to go on holidays for a long period of time, or you just need a break from your baking, but your beloved starter, you don't want to let it languish in the back of the fridge for too long. What do you do? So you can dry it. All you need is, I've actually dried some today. So I've got these bits of paper. This is just non-stick baking paper or parchment paper. So once your starter is fully active, it has to be really alive and full of yeast. Just get a spatula and spoon some out and just scrape it out really thinly on your, on your parchment paper. And then hopefully you've got dry weather. If you see a dry day, like if you can feel that the air is really, really dry, that's a good way to do it. We've had really low humidity the last day or two, so I took advantage of the time to make lots of dried starter, and it dried pretty much overnight. But if you don't have a dry environment, then you can put the oven light on and just put it in there and let it dry. And once it's dry, it will start to kind of peel up. You'll see the color difference too. It will actually look dry. Once it starts to peel off, it will actually flake off the paper, and then you just scrunch it up. Put it into a Ziploc bag. So this is Boris, 18th of June 2018, and then keep it in the freezer. Somebody said, oh, can you keep it at room temperature? Can you keep it in the fridge, or should you put it in the freezer? The answer is all of the above. It will just last longer if it's colder. So I would keep, this will last in the freezer for years, absolutely years. I've revived them, you know, one out of the freezer that I've had in there for a couple of years. So that's a really good way to do it, especially if it's really fresh and really active when it goes in and it's nice and dry. But you could also, you know, keep it in the fridge at least for a few months, probably longer. Room temperature is okay too, but if you live in a hot climate, then, you know, it's going to deteriorate faster. So if you've got access to a freezer, stick a little one of these in your freezer and you'll have plenty backup in case anything ever happens to it. But I've been keeping this starter going fresh like this, and I have sent it all over the place. It's pretty well traveled, Boris. I've been keeping it like this and using it regularly for 9 years now. So it's pretty hardy, and if you're a regular, at least once a week bread baker like I am, then you won't have any problem at all. Thank you so much for watching. I think this is a really long video now, but it is what it is, and I hope you've got something out of it. Yeah, please, if you've got any extra questions that I didn't cover, please let me know in the comments below, or come to my Elly's Everyday Sourdough Facebook page and you can contact me there. It's been a real pleasure to put this together. I should have done it a long time ago. I hope it's been helpful. Thanks everyone.